She said she was done with our marriage like it meant nothing. I nodded once, picked up the bag I'd already packed, and walked out. She thought I'd beg. Instead, she found out what I built in silence destroyed everything she planned. My name is Bryce Prescott. I'm 42 years old. I own 5 pizza franchise locations across Central Ohio, and I was, up until recently, a married man. My wife, Scarlett, is 41. She built herself a solid career as a branding consultant, freelance mostly, but with a boutique agency partnership that brought in good money. We met in our early 20s, got married when I was 23, and had our daughter Zoe the following year. 18 years of raising that girl. And then one August morning we drove her to Columbus, helped her move in her dorm, hugged her in a parking lot that smelled like fresh asphalt and new beginnings, and drove home in almost complete silence. I thought the quiet in the car was just the natural weight of that moment. Zoe was our kid. Watching her walk away with a laundry basket and a mini fridge was hard for both of us. Or so I thought. By the time we pulled back into our driveway in Westerville, something had already shifted in Scarlett. I couldn't name it that night. But looking back now, I can see it clearly. She walked into the house, set her purse on the counter, and exhaled, long and slow, like she'd been holding her breath for years and had finally been given permission to let it go. I noticed it over the following 2 weeks. Small things at first. She started leaving the house earlier in the mornings without saying where she was going. She began taking her phone into the bathroom, which she'd never done before in 19 years of marriage. She bought new clothes. Not the kind she wore to client meetings, but the kind you buy when you want to feel like a different person. A younger person. A freer one. The evening it really hit me. I was sitting at the kitchen table going over expansion projections for a potential 6th location in Dublin. Scarlett walked through the front door at 9:15. She smelled like a restaurant I didn't recognize. She said she'd been at a client dinner. I asked which client. She said it was someone new and walked upstairs without elaborating. I sat there with my spreadsheets and listened to the sound of her footsteps above me. Something in my gut twisted. Not jealousy exactly. More like the slow, sick feeling you get when you realize a problem you've been ignoring has gotten much bigger than you thought. The next morning, I told myself I was being paranoid. This was Scarlett. We had 19 years, a daughter, a mortgage, a life. People didn't just dismantle all of that. Not without a reason. Not without a conversation. I poured myself a cup of coffee, looked out the window at the backyard where Zoe used to run through the sprinkler every summer, and made myself a quiet promise. I was going to pay attention. Not in a paranoid, obsessive way. Just the way you pay attention when the check engine light comes on and you can't afford to ignore it anymore. That same week, I found my old laptop in the basement, the one from several years back that I'd replaced with a newer model. I'd plugged it in to pull some old franchise files I needed. While I was searching through folders, I clicked into a directory called Personal Archive without thinking much of it. What I found there stopped me cold. Inside were draft documents. Email drafts, to be specific. One was addressed to a law office I didn't recognize, a family law practice based in Columbus. The document was dated 3 years ago. I stared at the date for a long moment, certain I was misreading it. I wasn't. It was a draft inquiry letter, asking about the process of filing for divorce in Franklin County, asking about asset division, asking what a spouse was entitled to after a long marriage in the state of Ohio. 3 years ago, Zoe had just turned 15. I was opening my 4th franchise location. Scarlett and I had gone to Myrtle Beach that summer and walked on the beach every evening. I had photographs of that trip on my phone. She was smiling in every single one. I sat down on the basement floor with that old laptop balanced on my knees, reading a letter my wife had drafted 3 years ago, while she was smiling at me on a beach. And I understood, for the first time, that I had been living inside a story that wasn't entirely true. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't confront her the next day either. I just closed the laptop, went upstairs, and started paying very close attention. Paying attention is a skill most married men let go rusty. I was no different. For years I'd operated on autopilot. Franchise meetings, payroll reviews, supplier calls, home for dinner, sleep, repeat. It's not that I stopped caring about Scarlett. I just stopped looking closely. And when you stop looking closely at someone, you miss the moment they stop being yours. After finding those draft emails on the old laptop, I didn't sleep well for 3 nights straight. I lay there in the dark beside her, listening to her breathe, and ran the math over and over. 3 years ago, Zoe had been 15. We'd been in Myrtle Beach. Scarlett had laughed at something I said on the pier and grabbed my arm with both hands. Had that been real? Or had I been a placeholder she hadn't yet figured out how to remove? I didn't let any of it show. That was deliberate. The moment you tip your hand, you lose leverage, and I'd spent enough years negotiating franchise agreements to understand that much. So I kept showing up to breakfast with a normal face and asking normal questions and watching. What I saw wasn't dramatic. It rarely is at first. It was the texture of things. The way Scarlett angled her phone away from me when she typed. The way she'd leave a room to take a call and come back a minute later with the kind of composed expression people practice in mirrors. She started working late at her agency too, sometimes 3 evenings a week. When I asked about the projects, her answers were technically detailed but somehow empty. The right words, none of the substance. One Thursday evening, I drove past the branding agency's building on my way back from checking on the Polaris location. The parking lot was mostly empty. Scarlett's car wasn't there. I didn't follow her. I want to be clear about that. I drove home, changed my shirt, and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and my own thoughts for company. That same week, Zoe called from Columbus. It was a Wednesday. She called every Sunday, so a midweek call was unusual. She sounded strange, careful, like she was picking each word before she said it. "Dad," she started, "I just want you to know I love you. Whatever's going on at home, I love you." I set down my coffee mug. "What did your mother tell you?" A pause, long enough to answer the question without words. "She called you," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. "She said you'd been distant," Zoe admitted, her voice tight. "That you were stressed about the business and taking it out on her. That things have been hard for a long time." I pressed my thumb against the side of the mug and kept my voice even. "And what do you think, Zoe?" Not what she said. "What do you think?" Another silence. Then, "I don't know what to think, Dad. That's why I called you." That was the moment I understood exactly what Scarlett was doing. She hadn't just been checking out of the marriage. She'd been building a narrative, quietly, methodically, positioning herself as the patient, suffering spouse long before any of this became official. She got into Zoe first. My daughter was in a dorm room in Columbus trying to figure out which version of her family was true, and Scarlett had made sure her version landed first. I told Zoe I loved her. I told her I wasn't going to ask her to take sides. I told her the truth would sort itself out, and that she didn't need to carry any of this while she was in school. She cried a little. So did I, after I hung up, sitting alone at that kitchen table in a house that used to feel full. The following Saturday, Scarlett told me she was going to client brunch in the short north. She left at 10, dressed in a way that had nothing to do with brunch. I noticed the necklace, a thin gold chain with a small pendant I didn't recognize. Not something I'd given her. Not something I'd ever seen before. I spent that morning at the Westerville location, walking the floor, talking to my manager Kevin, pretending to care about the weekend prep schedule. But part of my brain was running quietly in the background like a program I couldn't close. That afternoon, I called a family law attorney named Patricia Dunn. I'd gotten her name from a business associate who'd gone through an ugly divorce 2 years prior. I didn't tell her everything yet. I just asked questions. About Ohio law. About asset protection. About what a man in my position should and shouldn't do before anything became official. She asked me one question before we wrapped up the call. "Does your wife know you're calling me?" "No," I said. "Good," Patricia replied. "Keep it that way for now." I hung up and looked out the window at the street. Somewhere across town, Scarlett was at a brunch that wasn't a brunch, wearing a necklace I'd never seen before, with a story about me already loaded and aimed at our daughter. And I was done being the man who didn't look closely enough. Patricia Dunn had given me one piece of advice at the end of our first call. Document everything, and do it on paper. Not on a shared device. Not in a cloud account Scarlett could theoretically access. Paper. Old school. So I bought a plain brown notebook from a drugstore on my way home from the Polaris location one afternoon, and I started writing. Dates. Times. Observations. The necklace I hadn't given her. The evenings she came home smelling like somewhere else. The way her voice changed slightly when she was on the phone in another room. Lower, quieter, more careful. I wrote down the draft emails I'd found on the old laptop, including the date stamp. I wrote down the call with Zoe. I wrote down every inconsistency. I could remember going back several months. It wasn't obsession. It was preparation. By the third week of September, I had a clearer picture. Scarlett was seeing someone. I didn't have a name yet, but the pattern was too consistent to explain away. The Thursday evenings, the Saturday brunches that ran long, the new energy she carried into the house like something she'd picked up somewhere else and couldn't quite put down before she walked through the door. I also called Patricia again, a longer conversation this time. I told her about the draft emails. She told me that in Ohio, evidence of intent to divorce wouldn't change the asset division formula significantly, but it would establish a timeline that could matter if misconduct became relevant. She asked if I had any reason to believe marital funds were being used inappropriately. I told her I'd been watching our joint accounts and hadn't noticed anything unusual yet. She told me to keep watching. That same week, I took a quiet step I hadn't planned, but that felt necessary. I called our accountant, Ray Mullen, who'd handled my franchise finances for 8 years. I asked him to run a full audit of our personal joint accounts alongside the business accounts, framing it as preparation for a possible expansion loan. Ray didn't question it. He was thorough, and within 4 days he flagged something. Over the past 14 months, there had been a series of transfers, small enough individually not to raise immediate concern, but consistent. A few hundred here, 500 there, all moving to an account Ray didn't recognize. Not one of our joint accounts, not a business account, something else. I thanked Ray, told him I'd follow up, and sat with that information for 2 days before calling Patricia again. The night everything shifted, Scarlett came home on a Wednesday, not one of her usual late nights, and she walked into the living room while I was sitting on the couch with a brown notebook closed on the cushion beside me. She stood in the doorway for a moment, arms loose at her sides, and looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you've decided to replace. "Bryce," she said evenly, "I think we need to talk." I closed the book I wasn't reading anyway and waited. "I think we've run our course." She delivered it without ceremony, without anger. Flat and final, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed until it no longer felt like anything. "I'm not happy. I haven't been for a long time, and I think we both know that." I looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a car passed on the street. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. 19 years of life, together compressed into a Wednesday evening in the living room. I nodded once. "Okay," I said. She tilted her head slightly, a flicker of something across her face. Confusion, maybe. She'd expected more. Tears, perhaps, or a fight, or the desperate negotiation of a man who didn't see it coming. What she didn't know was that I'd seen it coming for weeks. What she didn't know was the brown notebook, the attorney, the accountant's report, or the bag I'd packed and placed in the trunk of my car 3 days earlier, just in case. I stood up, picked up my keys from a side table, and walked toward the garage door. "That's it," she called after me, and for the first time that evening there was an edge in her voice. Something unsteady. I stopped with my hand on the doorframe. "You said you were done, Scarlett. I'm not going to argue with that." I turned just enough to look back at her. "You'll hear from my attorney." I walked through the garage, got in my car, and drove away without slamming a single door. 3 days later, I was in Patricia Dunn's office when my phone buzzed with a text from Scarlett. "We should talk. This isn't how I meant for this to go." I showed it to Patricia. She read it, set the phone down, and said, "She thought you'd fall apart." "I know," I replied. "She has no idea what you've already put in place." "That's correct." Patricia allowed herself a small smile. "Good. Let's keep it that way a little longer." I pocketed my phone and turned back to the documents on the desk in front of me. Outside the office window, Columbus moved through its ordinary Wednesday morning, entirely unaware that my ordinary life had just ended and that I was already building something better from the wreckage. The morning after I walked out, I woke up in a room at the Riverview Suites off I-270, a corporate extended stay place, quiet and anonymous, the kind where businessmen on long projects live out of roller bags and eat breakfast alone with their laptops. It suited me fine. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for space to think clearly, and for the first time in months, I had it. I ordered coffee from the lobby, spread Ray Mullen's account summary across the small desk, and went through every line. The transfers had been going on for 14 months. The total, when I added it up carefully, came to just over $22,000. Not a catastrophic number on its own, but $22,000 moved quietly out of a joint account without a word of explanation is not a small thing. It's a deliberate thing. It tells you something about the planning that went into what was happening. I called Patricia at 9 sharp. The transfers total 22,000. I told her. 14 months. Consistent amounts, irregular timing. Probably designed to avoid pattern recognition. Do you know where the money went? Ray traced it to an account opened under her maiden name. A pause on Patricia's end. Then, she opened a personal account under her maiden name during the marriage. 14 months ago. I confirmed. Bryce, that's not impulsive. That's a strategy. I already knew that. What I needed from Patricia was to understand what it meant legally and what I could do about it. She walked me through it. In Ohio, marital funds diverted unilaterally during a marriage are subject to recapture in divorce proceedings. It wouldn't be simple, but it wasn't untouchable either. The documentation Ray had already pulled would form the backbone of that argument. After the call, I drove to my Westerville location. I needed to move, needed the familiar rhythm of walking a floor and talking to people I trusted. My manager Kevin was opening up when I arrived, counting the morning till with the focused calm of a man who'd been doing it for years. You look like you haven't slept, he observed without looking up. I haven't much, I admitted. I poured myself a coffee from a bag and stood at the prep counter. Kevin, if I needed to move some operational changes through quietly over the next few weeks, ownership documentation, account access, that kind of thing, could you handle the floor without me for stretches? He looked up then, read my face, said nothing for a moment. Yeah, boss. I've got it. That was enough. Later that afternoon, my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't expected. Scarlett's brother, a guy named Dale who I'd always gotten along with reasonably well. He was calling, I suspected, because Scarlett had sent him. Bryce, hey. His voice was careful. Look, man, I'm not trying to get in the middle of anything, but Scarlett's pretty shaken up. She says you just left without really talking. I kept my voice level. She told me she was done, Dale. I took her at her word. She said it didn't come out right. She says she wants to actually sit down, and she had 19 years to sit down. I cut in quietly. She filed away divorce attorney emails 3 years ago and never said a word to me. That's not a conversation that didn't come out right. That's a plan. Silence on his end. I'm not angry at her. I continued. I'm not going to make this ugly if she doesn't. But I'm not walking back in that house without a legal agreement in place. That part's done. Dale exhaled. Okay, I hear you. After I hung up, I sat in my car outside the franchise for a while, watching the lunchtime traffic filter in and out. A man and his teenage son walked in together, the kid holding the door open. The dad clapped him on the shoulder as they went inside. I thought about Zoe. I thought about the fact that she was 3 hours away in Columbus, trying to make sense of a phone call from her mother that had been designed to shape her before I could say a word. That was the part that sat heaviest. Not the money, not the attorney meetings, not even the necklace I hadn't given her. The fact that Scarlett had reached for our daughter first. I pulled out my phone and typed a text to Zoe. Short. Nothing that put pressure on her. Thinking about you today. Call me when you want to talk. No rush, no agenda. Love you, Dad. She replied 40 minutes later with a single heart. It wasn't much, but it was something real, and right now, real was everything I was working toward. Todd Briggs and I have been friends for 14 years. We met through a mutual contact at a franchise expo in Cincinnati back when I was opening my second location, and he was selling commercial kitchen equipment. We'd watched each other's kids grow up, gone to Ohio State games together, shared beers on his back porch every summer. He was the kind of friend you assumed was just always going to be there, the kind you stop thinking about too carefully because the friendship feels permanent, like furniture. I called him the week after I moved into the Riverview Suites. We met at a sports bar in Gahanna that we'd been going to for years, corner booth, same as always. Todd was already there when I arrived, nursing a Coke, which was unusual. He ordered Coke when he was nervous. We made small talk for about 4 minutes. Then I set my hands flat on the table and said, "Tell me what you know, Todd." He looked at his glass. "Because I've been putting this together for a few weeks now," I continued, keeping my voice quiet and even. "And I think you know more than you've let on. So I'd rather you just say it." Todd exhaled through his nose. He turned the glass in his hands. Then he started talking. He'd seen Scarlett and a man he didn't recognize at the Easton Town Center last spring. The two of them at an outdoor table, leaning close, the way people lean when they don't care who sees them. Todd had told himself it could be a client meeting. He'd told himself it wasn't his place. He'd told himself a lot of things, apparently, for about 7 months. Then he got to the part that changed everything. About 3 months ago, Scarlett had called him. She told him she knew he'd seen her. She told him she needed him to stay quiet. And she'd offered him something in exchange for that silence. Made it clear, Todd said, eyes down, that she was willing to make it worth his while. Personally, he sat across from me with his shoulders forward and his voice low, framing it carefully. She'd come on to him, he said. She'd been the aggressor. He'd been caught off guard, he said. He wanted me to understand it wasn't something he pursued. I listened to all of it. I sat completely still and listened to 14 years of friendship explain itself across a sticky bar table. I let him finish. I let him get to the end of his version of events, where he was the surprised one, the reluctant one, the one who'd been put in an impossible position by my wife. Then I stood up. I wasn't loud about it. I didn't shout. But my hand caught the edge of the table as I rose, and the whole thing lurched sideways. Glasses sliding, Todd grabbing the edge, and the sound of it cut through the noise of the bar like a gunshot. I didn't touch him. I stepped around the table and stood close enough that he pressed back against the booth cushion without thinking. His hands came up slightly. His jaw tightened. He was ready to defend himself. I raised one finger, pointed it directly at his face, looked him dead in the eye. "You," I said. That was all. One word. I held it there for 2 seconds, long enough for him to understand exactly what it meant. And then I walked out of that bar without looking back. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes. Hands on the wheel. Engine off. The rage was there, white in total, but I knew better than to let it steer. I'd built 5 businesses. I knew what happened when you made decisions from the hottest part of your anger. You made mistakes you couldn't undo. I took out my phone and called Patricia Dunn. Told her what Todd had said. She listened carefully. "Can he be compelled to testify?" "If it comes to that," she replied. "But right now, what matters most is that you know. We'll document it. And Bryce, this changes the misconduct calculus considerably." I drove back to the hotel. I ordered food I didn't taste. I opened the brown notebook and wrote everything down while it was still precise and fresh. Todd's exact words, the date, the location, the Coke he'd been drinking when he told me my best friend had kept my wife's secret in exchange for something I wouldn't name out loud. 14 years. Gone. Not with a fight. With a finger and one word. My parents live in a house outside of Granville that my father built with 2 partners in 1987. It's a solid house. Brick. Practical. The kind that's been through 35 Ohio winters without apology. My mother, Carol, is warm and instinctive. My father, Gene, is a retired civil engineer who communicates in short declarative sentences and has strong opinions about everything from concrete mix ratios to character. A week after the scene with Todd, Scarlett drove to Granville. I didn't know about it until my mother called me that evening, her voice careful and measured in the way it gets when she's working through something. "Scarlett came by today," she said. I set down the investor report I'd been reviewing. "I know." She was upset. She said you left without warning, that you'd been distant and focused on the business, and that she'd felt alone for years. A pause. "She cried, Bryce." "I'm sure she did. Your father asked her to leave." That stopped me. What did he say? My mother's voice carried a thread of something between pride and relief. He let her finish. He sat there at the kitchen table and listened to everything she said. And then he stood up and said, "My son doesn't do things without a reason. And whatever his reason is, it's enough for me." And then he opened the front door. I didn't speak for a moment. Outside my hotel window, a car moved through the wet street, headlights sliding across the ceiling of my room. She tried to say something else. My mother added quietly. He just held the door. I thanked my mother. I told her I'd explain everything when I could. She told me she loved me and that dinner was available any Sunday. I wanted to show up. I hung up and sat with that for a while. The image of my 71-year-old father standing at his front door, not saying another word, just holding it open. That's a particular kind of language. One Scarlett clearly hadn't anticipated. The following week, Patricia called with an update that arrived like a second round. Scarlett had retained an attorney, a man named Foster Greer, known in Columbus legal circles for aggressive pretrial filings and pressure tactics. Within 48 hours of his involvement, a motion landed on Patricia's desk claiming that I had been emotionally unavailable throughout the marriage, that Scarlett had suffered from what the filing calls sustained relational neglect, and that she was seeking, among other things, a claim against my franchise business valuations, and half of my pension contributions accumulated over 19 years of marriage. Patricia called it expected. I called it calculated. But Greer also attached something that surprised even Patricia, a signed statement from a licensed therapist claiming that Scarlett had been seeking treatment for depression and anxiety caused, in part, by conditions within the marriage. The therapist had been seeing her for 8 months. The statement was carefully worded, professionally presented, and designed to do one thing: make me look like the cause of her suffering. Patricia read the relevant section to me over the phone. When she finished, I said, 8 months ago, Zoe was still living at home, and things looked perfectly normal from the outside. She was already building this. Yes, Patricia said, which means we need an independent evaluator. Someone with no connection to either of you who can review the marriage timeline objectively. She paused. It won't be fast, but it'll matter. Set it up, I said. That evening I drove to Worthington and walked through the neighborhood where Scarlett and I used to take evening walks before everything got complicated. I wasn't feeling sentimental. I walked there because I needed to move, needed air, needed to be somewhere that wasn't a hotel room or a law office. I walked for 40 minutes, hands in my pockets, watching other people's lit windows pass by. The pension number Patricia had quoted sat in the back of my mind. 19 years of contributions. A number that represented not just money, but decisions. Vacations I hadn't taken, upgrades I hadn't made, mornings I'd gone in before sunrise because building something real required that kind of consistency. Scarlett wanted half of it. A therapist's letter and an aggressive attorney were her tools. Fine, I thought. I had tools of my own. Patricia Dunn had a saying she used when a case started generating paperwork faster than either side could manage. The truth lives in the documents. By the third week of October, I understood exactly what she meant. Foster Greer's office had filed 4 separate motions in 11 days. The first challenged the valuation methodology Patricia's team intended to use for the franchise locations. The second requested full disclosure of all business accounts going back 7 years. The third was a petition for temporary spousal support during proceedings. Scarlett, apparently, had decided that her branding consulting income wasn't sufficient to maintain her current lifestyle while we sorted out 19 years of shared assets. The fourth, the one that took me a full evening to process, was a formal challenge to our prenuptial agreement. Scarlett claimed she'd signed it under duress, that I'd introduced it 10 days before the wedding, and that she'd felt pressure by the timing and circumstance. What she apparently forgot, or chose to ignore, was that her attorney at the time, a woman named Gloria Fisk out of Dublin law firm, had reviewed every clause and signed off on the document with a notarized certification that Scarlett had entered the agreement freely and with full understanding of its terms. I called Patricia the morning after reading Greer's filing. She's claiming duress, I said. I read it last night, Patricia replied. It won't survive contact with Gloria Fisk's notarization record. But Greer knows that. He's not filing this to win it. He's filing it to slow us down and increase your legal costs. Standard pressure tactic. So we respond and move on. We respond thoroughly, document the original process completely, and yes, we move on. A pause. I do want to flag something else. Greer's business account disclosure request is broad enough to pull your franchise operational records into the proceeding in a way that could complicate the asset valuation timeline. I thought about that for a moment. What do you need from me? Your accountant, your franchise agreements, and about 4 hours on Saturday. Ray Mullen came in on Saturday morning. We spread everything across Patricia's conference table. 7 years of franchise financials, the original formation documents for each location, my personal investment records, and Ray's analysis of the marital account transfers. Patricia's associate, a precise young man named Garrett who spoke in complete sentences and never seemed to blink, took notes throughout. By early afternoon, we had a clear picture of what Greer could access and what was protected, and more importantly, we'd identified 3 additional transfers from a joint account that Ray hadn't flagged in his initial review. Small amounts, but consistent with the pattern. The total, revised, was just over $26,000. I drove from Patricia's office to my Dublin location, the one I'd been considering as a template for the 6th franchise. I walked the floor, talked with the afternoon shift, approved a menu adjustment my manager had been requesting for 2 months. Normal things. Necessary things. Then I sat in the back office and opened my phone. There was a text from Scarlett, the third that week. Bryce, I think we should talk before this gets worse. I didn't want it to go this way. I stared at it. Then I forwarded it to Patricia with a single line. Another one. Same pattern. Patricia replied within minutes. Document and ignore. She's feeling the pressure. I put the phone in my pocket and went back to the floor. That evening, I drove to my parents' house in Granville for the first time since everything started. My mother had made a pot roast, the kind that takes all day, the kind she made when she wanted to say something without words. My father, Gene, was in the garage when I pulled up, doing something unnecessary to a perfectly functional lawnmower. He looked up, gave me a single nod, and went back to what he was doing. We ate dinner mostly in silence. My mother talked about the garden, about a neighbor's new fence, about a recipe she'd found that she thought might work as a Thanksgiving alternative. My father ate and listened and said very little. After dinner, I helped with the dishes, and when my mother went to fold laundry, my father poured 2 coffees and set one in front of me without being asked. He sat down across from me, looked at his mug for a moment. That woman came here, he said. Not angry, just factual. I know, Dad. Mom told me. She sat in my living room and told me my son was the problem. He turned the mug in his hands. I've known you 42 years. I know what kind of man you are. I didn't say anything. I just let that sit there between us, because some things land better without a response. Gene set his mug down. You going to be all right? Yeah, I said. I'm going to be all right. He nodded once. Good. He stood up, picked up his coffee, and went back to whatever he'd been doing in the garage. That was the whole conversation, and it was exactly enough. I took 4 days off in early November. Not a vacation. I'm not sure I was capable of a vacation in the traditional sense at that point. But Patricia had told me I needed to step away from the documents and the phone calls and the legal machinery for a stretch, or I was going to burn out before we got to the part that mattered. So I drove east, into the mountains. I ended up in a small town in western North Carolina called Spruce Hill, the kind of place that shows up on no one's radar, which was exactly why I chose it. A main street with a hardware store, a diner, a bookshop with a hand-lettered sign, and an inn run by a woman named Bet who handed me a key without asking anything beyond my name and how long I was staying. The first morning I woke up at 5:30 and couldn't get back to sleep. I put on a jacket and walked out into the dark. The air was cold and sharp and completely different from the recycled air of the hotel in Columbus. It had weight to it, the kind that reminds your body it's alive. I walked uphill for about 40 minutes, following a trail that a note on Betty's bulletin board had described as manageable but not trivial. By the time the sun came over the ridge, I was breathing hard and standing in light that fell across the tree line in long gold sheets. I sat on a flat rock and stayed there for almost an hour. No phone, no documents, just the sound of the wind and the occasional bird and my own breathing settling back to normal. I came back to the same spot the next 3 mornings. On the third afternoon, I was sitting on the inn's front porch with a coffee when a man settled into the chair beside me. He was perhaps 67, lean, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years outdoors. He introduced himself as Frank Adler, retired civil engineer, he said, which made me think of my father, widower for 3 years. He came to Spruce Hill every November because his wife had loved it, and he'd made a promise to keep coming. We talked for 2 hours, not about my situation specifically. I gave him the outline without the details, and he didn't press. What Frank talked about mostly was the decade before his wife died. How he'd worked too much. How he'd mistaken building a good life for living one. How his wife had finally, in her patient and specific way, told him that security without presence was just a well-furnished absence. She wasn't complaining, Frank said, looking out of the mountains. She was describing. There's a difference. A complaining person wants you to feel bad. A describing person just wants to be understood. I turned that over. The woman I was married to, I said carefully, wasn't describing. She was already somewhere else. Frank looked at me sideways. Then that's a different problem entirely. He stood up, coffee finished. You seem like a man who knows the difference between his faults and someone else's choices. Don't let anyone talk you out of that distinction. He shook my hand and went inside. I sat on that porch until the light went entirely. Then I pulled out my phone, first time in 2 days, and found a voicemail from Zoe. She called that afternoon. Her voice was different from the last time we'd spoken. More settled, less careful. Dad, I've been thinking about everything. I want to hear your side. The whole thing. Can we talk this weekend? I love you. I listened to it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the porch railing, looked at the last of the light on the mountains, and felt something in my chest that had been wound tight for weeks released by about one full turn. Not fixed, not resolved, but moving. I called Zoe back that evening and talked to her for an hour and a half. The longest unguarded conversation we had since she left for Columbus. I didn't make Scarlett the villain. I just told her the truth. The draft emails, the transfers, the prenup challenge, the necklace I'd never bought. Zoe listened without interrupting. At the end, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Dad?" "Because I didn't want you to carry it," I admitted. "You had enough to build." She exhaled slowly. "I'm your daughter. I can carry more than you think." I drove back to Columbus the next morning with Frank Adler's words sitting quiet in the back of my mind, the mountains getting smaller in the rearview mirror, and the road ahead of me finally starting to feel like something other than a detour. Patricia Dunn scheduled the settlement conference for the second week of December. By then, Foster Greer's pressure campaign had produced exactly the results he'd intended. A mountain of paperwork for postponed hearings, and a legal bill that made me grateful I'd spent 15 years building businesses instead of spending what they earned. What Greer hadn't anticipated was that none of it had moved me an inch. We met in a conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Columbus building, Patricia and I on one side, Greer and Scarlett on the other. It was the first time I'd seen Scarlett in person since the night I walked out of our house. She looked composed, polished. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and had her hair done the way she did when she wanted to project control. She didn't look at me when I sat down. Greer opened by restating their position. The prenup was invalid. The franchise assets were marital property subject to 50-50 division. The pension contributions were fully divisible, and Scarlett was entitled to 36 months of spousal support, given the length of the marriage and her contribution to the household. Patricia let him finish. Then she opened her folder and began. She presented Ray Mullen's revised financial analysis, the $26,000 in unilateral transfers, documented, dated, and traced to an account opened under Scarlett's maiden name. She presented the original prenup with Gloria Fisk's notarization and certification record, which dismantled the duress claim before it could draw breath. She presented the independent business valuations, which established that all 5 franchise locations have been built through my direct operational labor and entrepreneurial risk, assets that predated the marriage's deterioration and reflected my specific expertise, not passive marital investment. Then Patricia set the draft emails on the table, the ones from 3 years ago, addressed to a family law firm, asking about divorce in Franklin County. Greer had seen them before in discovery, but seeing them laid on a conference table across from his client had a different effect. Scarlett's composed expression didn't break. She was too controlled for that, but something behind her eyes flickered and went still. Your client, Patricia said evenly, began planning the dissolution of this marriage while the couple was on a family vacation in Myrtle Beach, while attending their daughter's school events, while celebrating holidays in a home my client maintained and funded. We're not here to litigate motive, but we are here to ensure that preparation is not rewarded with a settlement that treats 19 years of documented deception as irrelevant. Greer conferred with Scarlett in a low voice for 2 minutes. Then they came back with a revised position. The prenup challenge was dropped. The franchise valuation argument was substantially reduced. Scarlett would retain the marital home and its equity. The pension contributions would be split, but calculated from the date of documented planning rather than the date of separation, a distinction that mattered significantly. Spousal support was reduced to 18 months. It wasn't a perfect outcome. The pension split still cost me a real number, but the marital home was hers, which meant I didn't have to see it again. The businesses were mine, intact. The transfers were ordered repaid through the settlement calculation, and Scarlett's attorney's pressure campaign had produced exactly nothing that stuck. Patricia and I shook hands in the elevator afterward. She said I'd been a good client, prepared, disciplined, and she used a word I appreciated: clear. She said clients who knew what they wanted and stayed anchored to it made her job possible. I drove directly from the attorney's office to the Dublin location, ordered a coffee from my own counter, sat with it in a corner booth for 20 minutes while the lunch rush moved around me. People ordering food, paying, talking, going about their ordinary Wednesday. I sat in the middle of all of that and let the resolution settle into something I could carry forward rather than back. That evening I called Zoe. She answered before the second ring. "How did it go?" "It's done," I said. A pause. Then, quietly, "Dad, I'm so sorry I didn't call you sooner. When she called me that first time, I should have known better. You were 3 weeks into college," I said. "You were doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing. Don't carry that." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I come home for winter break? I mean, wherever you are is home." Something landed in my chest at that. Clean and solid, like a foundation being laid. "Yeah, Zoe," I said. "Come home." Zoe came back to Columbus in mid-December. I'd moved out of the Riverview Suites by then and into a 2-bedroom apartment in the short north. A neighborhood with enough life in it that the quiet, when it came, felt chosen rather than imposed. I'd furnished it simply. A good couch. A kitchen table with 4 chairs I'd probably never fill all at once. Bookshelves I was in the process of stocking again, slowly. Zoe showed up on a Friday evening with a duffel bag, a plant she'd been keeping alive in her dorm room since August, and her mother's eyes and a face that had always been entirely her own. She walked through the apartment, looked at everything without commenting, and then sat down at the kitchen table like she'd always sat there. "It's good," she said. "It feels like you." We spent that evening doing nothing important. I made dinner, something I hadn't cooked for anyone in months. And we ate at that table and talked the way we used to talk when she was in high school, and we'd stay up too late on Fridays because neither of us had anywhere to be the next morning. She told me about her roommate, her classes, a professor she decided was the best she'd ever had. I told her about the Dublin expansion moving forward and about Spruce Hill and Frank Adler and what he'd said about distinguishing someone's faults from someone else's choices. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Are you going to be okay, Dad?" "Really?" I thought about that question honestly before I answered. "Yeah," I said. "I really am." She looked at me, for a moment, the way perceptive people look at you when they're deciding whether you're telling the truth. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied. 4 months after that December, the divorce was finalized. Scarlett had the house. I had the businesses. The settlement held. Blaine Coster, I learned through a mutual contact, had ended things with Scarlett sometime in January. Apparently, the complications of the divorce proceedings had made the relationship inconvenient. Scarlett relocated to a smaller place in Clintonville. I heard she'd taken on more freelance clients. I didn't look further into it than that. Todd Briggs called once in January, and I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was mostly about explaining himself. I deleted it without finishing it. 14 years of friendship ended not with a confrontation or a dramatic final reckoning, just a deleted voicemail and a contact removed from a phone. Some things don't deserve ceremony. The 6th franchise location opened in Dublin in late March. Kevin ran the floor at the Westerville location like it was his own, which was exactly what I needed. Ray Mullen called to tell me the first quarter numbers were the strongest I'd posted in 3 years. On a Saturday in April, Zoe drove up from Columbus with a friend, just for the day, just to walk around and have lunch. We ended up at a small place on High Street with outdoor seating and too many plants hanging from the ceiling. We ordered more food than we needed and ate slowly and talked about nothing in particular. At one point, Zoe said, completely unprompted, "I'm glad you didn't fight for the house, Dad. It always felt more like hers than yours." I thought about that. "You might be right. This version of you seems more like yours," she said, and went back to her food without making a production of it. That was enough, not in some neat, concluded, final chapter kind of way. More like the feeling after you've finished a long drive you weren't sure you could make. The road behind you is real. The destination is in front of you, and you're still driving. The Dublin location was full that Saturday evening. I stood at the back, watching the floor run the way I'd built it to run, thinking about the next one. Because there was always a next one. That was the thing about building something real. You never actually finished. You just kept going, and the going itself became the point.